Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and get started. Yeah. Oh, let's get it. Now, all right. We appreciate everybody being here. We're talking, we're kind of continuing what we talked about last week in the book. We're kind of moving into this question of the pattern of church organization in terms of cooperation between churches. And so we talked about a few things last week. Well, in fact, before we begin, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer and we'll go and start. Our holy God, our Father in heaven, we thank you for our day. We thank you for the rain that you're blessing us with. Thank you for all the blessings of life you give us. We pray, Father, that as we study your word, as we think about things pertaining to your church, that you would guide us into truth, that you would help us to have good hearts and willingness to find the pattern that you've left for us, and that always that we would seek to do things according to your will, that you would be glorified. We pray all this in your son's name. All right, so we're still on we're still in the same chapter, but we're going to move into a little bit more today, some things that Kyle wrote in the next chapter. Um, if you want to, in fact, turn over, there's some points I want to make out of on page 84. This is where, in fact, actually, you go back, actually, to 80 is probably a good place for us to start. Uh, if you're, we're talking about the idea of church collective responsibility in terms of spreading the gospel, in terms of the benevolent support of the saints, and in terms of the encouragement of the body, and how we go about doing that. And if you remember, we started with the premise that both, no matter whether you start on the institutional or the non-institutional section side of this question, we always seem to start from the first place, which is we need to follow the pattern. In fact, Brother Ramsey in his article says this very clearly. There's a pattern given to us, and we ought to be following that pattern. So we ask that question, well, why then, if we're all following the pattern, then why do we have such different ideas about what that pattern looks like? And so that's one of the things that we're looking at here. And we talked a little bit about this question of individual versus collective last week, and I think we covered that pretty well. So we're not going to deal with that. But just to remind ourselves, we talked about what we read in James 1 and Galatians 6, and Brother Ramsey's argument, which is that we have in James 1 what he calls a representative individual, meaning that James is talking about an individual, but what he's really doing is teaching us a collective mission. And so that everything we read in James 1 that's talked about in an individual standpoint, he says, is also talking about the collective. And we talked about why that really doesn't make a lot of sense. You really have to insert that into the text to make the argument. And so with that in mind, we're getting into some of the specific applications, and we get into this question of cooperation. And I almost went down the road of talking about the question of church responsibility to the saints as opposed to those in the world, but we do have a chapter coming on that, so I'm not going to deal with that right now. So we're gonna stay just in the question of the collective action and how it's to be organized. And he makes a point as he moves into this question of evangelism. He asks this question: how did the early church organize to support the work of the work of evangelism? And of course, who do we read about? What's the example that we see in the Bible of an individual being supported by churches to preach the gospel? Larry. Yeah, yeah, yeah. 2 Corinthians 11:8. In fact, that's one of the passages that he's going to go to in this section. Uh, we see the example of Paul being supported, doing the work, and he makes an argument here, and maybe y'all can help me with this. I've never heard this argument before. Uh, if you go to page 82, in fact, he starts making this argument down here. He's talking about this idea of how the churches were organized, and he uses these passages that we typically will go to. He goes to 2 Corinthians 8, verse 13, which I think we're probably all familiar with, in talking about the collection of the saints, or for the saints. He says in verse 13, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but by an equality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. Now, if you remember, I know we're kind of diving right into the middle of 2 Corinthians 8, but what is who are the us and the them in this conversation? Sorry, let me get our slides where they need to be. Who's he talking about here? Do you remember? Yeah, Claire. Okay. Macedonia are some of the churches. And of course, by the way, when we talk about Macedonia, to bear in mind that we are talking about a region that is going to include several different cities and several different churches, such as anybody want to guess what are some churches in Macedonia that you can think of? Okay. Uh, Philippi, Corinth isn't in Macedonia, but it's kind of bordering on it. You've got Greece, and you've got Macedonia kind of up here, right? And they're very much related, but they are different regions. So yeah, so it's present day Greece, and Macedonia kind of reaches into that. So if you see, for example, when in Romans 15, where Paul talks about the churches in Macedonia and Achaia, when you read Achaia, you can think Greece, and specifically you can think Corinth, because that's really probably who he's talking about. So he says, all right, so you've got churches here in this region, and you've got churches in this region who need help, and one group is sending to help another group, and so he then moves on to the question of evangelism, and this is the passage that you mentioned earlier, 2 Corinthians 11:8. He says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And when I was present with you and in need, I was burdened to no one. For what was lacking to me, the brethren from Macedonia supplied. In all things, I have kept myself from being a burden to you, so I will keep myself. And so he then moves on to Philippians 4. If you want to look over there, Philippians 4, verse 15. If you remember now, he's writing to the Philippian church, which, by the way, is another church in the region of Macedonia. So he talks to the Philippians and says, now you Philippians know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, in other words, when I left where I was with you, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. So we have this example. Now, he makes a point here, and I had to think about this for a while. I frankly kind of struggled to get my arms around what he's saying. I'm just going to read his point here, and maybe kind of explain what he's saying. He says down at the end of 83, two of the above passages refer to the same time and situation. Paul had departed Macedonia and gone into Corinth. When he became in want, brethren, Silas and Timothy, according to Acts 18:5, supplied his needs with a gift from Philippi. Paul received wages from churches, but only the church in Philippi had fellowship with him in the matter of giving and receiving, and in relationship to the furtherance of the gospel. When Paul received the gift, he was able to continue preaching. At the same time, under consideration, Paul received wages from churches, yet at the same time, only the church at Philippi had fellowship with him. Therefore, it is the case that churches sent money to the church in Philippi, so that the church in Philippi, through Paul, could preach the gospel. Now, has anybody ever heard this argument before? I've never heard this. He's basically saying that because Paul says that I robbed other churches in 2 Corinthians 11, but in Philippians, he tells the Philippians that I had no fellowship with anyone other than you in terms of giving and receiving. He's making a distinction between robbing churches and receiving fellowship. In other words, I got money from these other churches, but I didn't have fellowship with them. The only one that I had fellowship with was Philippi. Now, has anybody ever heard that before? I can't think of an example of how I can give money to someone by any means and not have fellowship. Would you agree with that? Am I right on that? I don't know how that would work. But he's making a distinction here. And his point is staked on this idea in Philippians 4, where it says, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning gifts and receiving, but you only. So in other words, he's saying no other churches shared money with him. So when he talks about robbing churches in First Corinthians, that must mean that they didn't actually share directly with him. It had to be indirect sharing. That's the argument that he's making. From some of your expressions, you're getting the same thought I'm getting. I don't understand this logic. Because if I were to tell you, when I first started preaching, San Marcos was the only church that offered me support. What does that have to do with today? What I'm doing now? That mean that I never, no other church has ever supported me at that point? Would we make that argument? I don't think that we would, right? It's pretty obvious what Paul is saying here. When I first started out, you were the only ones that helped me out. That doesn't mean that other churches didn't help him out later. We talked about the idea of the silence of scriptures. I'm arguing from silence when I say that Paul at the beginning only got support from one church, but we don't read about anything else after that. Therefore, nobody ever sent him money but Philip. Are you following me here? That's the argument that he's making. And I've noticed as we get into this part, I mentioned he starts off in this article pretty well, but he starts to go off the rails. And by the time we get to the end, he's going to make an argument that is completely unrelated to the evidence that he's going to present. We'll kind of go through this and look at this a little bit. But I want to make sure we recognize what he's saying here and what he's leaving out. The big part being that he's making a distinction that if I send to a central group and that central group sends to somebody else, that there's no that there's no longer any contact between me and that other person. I'm no longer involved in his work. So that's the argument that he's making. And so he says the only way this could work is if there was a central organization or a central church, I should say, by which these funds were distributed. And so that's where he's going to make his argument. And let me ask you this question, because I think this is worth asking as well. When we think about the question of church cooperation in general, did churches cooperate? Okay, yeah. I think that's the argument that we would. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's how I would understand that. When he says I robbed other churches sent money to me. And by the way, it's when he doesn't say another church robbed other churches and sent money to me. He says I had a connection with those other churches. I took money from them. It's kind of a contradictory argument. You start to see that he's saying on the one hand, there's no fellowship connection between me and Church A over here. And Church A sends money to Church B, and Church B sends money to me. There's no fellowship connection, and yet Paul says there's still a transaction going on. I robbed that church. I took money from them. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Yeah. Uh, I don't know. It's the same word, isn't it? Which passage are you looking at again? It's let me look. Which chapter and verse again? It's First Corinthians, Philippians 4:15. Okay, let's just look. 4:15. Word is eikoinonoson, to share in something. It's going to be from the same root essentially of koinonia. So it's not the exact same word, but it's the same concept. I'd have to study that a little bit more, but it's a different way of saying, I think, something that's essentially the same thing. Yeah, yeah. But that's a good question. I'll have to look at that a little bit more to see. So examples of part. You mentioned one example. The church partnered with other churches in what ways? How did they cooperate together in the first century? Did they at all? Can we find any examples of that? Yeah, yeah. That's a form of cooperation, right? Is Do we find any examples of a church working directly or cooperating directly with another church? Okay, okay, okay. Yeah. Ac- Acts 11 seems to indicate that, right? If you look over, in fact, go quickly over to Acts 11. It's down in verse 27, where it says, in those days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea, and they did so, sending it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. And sounds like a collective word, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's an important distinction here. We see exactly how it happened, and I used to kind of make the argument that, well, this is an individual collection, and maybe it was, but there's nothing in the context that suggests that it is. This is something that they decided as a group to do, and so they decided, here's what we're going to do: we're going to collect funds from our members, we're going to entrust it to Paul and Barnabas, and we're going to send them, and he's going to give it, as you said, to the elders at that church. Who has oversight over that money? The elders do, right, Larry? Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're controlling something that has been trusted to somebody else at that point. Now, Laura, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's definitely a form of cooperation. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as you think about what's going on there, well, we can say it now. Why did Jerusalem feel compelled to send this letter down to Antioch? Do you remember what happened? What started that whole thing? In fact, you want to go over to flip over to Acts 15 real quick. What business was it of Jerusalem that Antioch was doing this or that or whatever? Okay, okay, right. Where were they coming from? Because they came down from Judea. By the way, whenever you see down from, Judea is south of Antioch. But when you see up from, down from in that area, typically what we're really talking about is Jerusalem. Yeah, you would go up to Jerusalem and down from Jerusalem. And so I suspect that what he's saying here specifically is that these people were coming from Jerusalem. So they were coming out of the church in Jerusalem and visiting around. And while they were out, they were saying, this is what you have to do. And so now you've got people in Antioch saying, well, the church in Jerusalem has apostles. They have, they have this, they have the elders there. They were the first church. Surely they know what's going on. There was some implied authority on their part, even though there's not an official authority. They should know what they're doing. And so the church in Jerusalem has to deal with this, and they send out notification to Antioch because these people had been representing themselves as having come from and representing that church, right? He goes down, if you go to uh yeah, down if you go down to verse 24, where he the text of this letter is, and he says in verse 24, since we have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words, unsettling your minds, though we gave them no instruction. It seemed good to us, having come to one accord, to choose men and send them to you with our beloved Paul and Barnabas, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you the same things by word of mouth. So, in other words, the idea is the reason we're sending this message is because we had people representing us about saying something that we never said. And so it is now our responsibility to deal with this. This is not the Church of Jerusalem dictating doctrine or creating church positions to be sent out to be followed by everybody else. This is the church confirming that no, we never taught this. We're teaching what we have always taught from the beginning, what the apostles have always revealed from us. Nothing has changed in that regard. And so it is important to remember, like you were saying, there's still autonomy going on here, but there's also recognition that there is a level of authority in Jerusalem, because who's still in Jerusalem right now? Apostles are. The apostles are still involved in this, and so there's a lot of different things going on there. But this is really the only example that we ever see of any church even appearing to dictate terms to another church. For the most part, those distinctions are pretty separate, right? But that authority is still covering all churches. In fact, there's one other example of congregational authority that I thought about, or congregational cooperation. It's over in Colossians 4. If you remember, at the end of the letter to the Colossians, Paul makes a reference to a letter that we don't have, and it'd be interesting to read it. Apparently, we don't need it because we don't have it. But he talks about the letter to the Laodiceans. He says in verse 15, "Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. And when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from Laodicea." But what's the implication there about these two congregations? Yeah, they're passing the letters around, and they seem to, the fact that in verse 15 it says, "Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea," does that imply that, seems to imply that these people knew each other, had association with each other, kind of like us in North Beach or West Side or Camel Road or some group somewhere down the road a little bit. We travel, we visit them, we know them. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, that was weird. The preacher that was doing the meeting in North Beach, she starts talking. His wife starts talking to Laura, and it turns out she's from Wichita and knows them. So small world again. But that's kind of how it is. So there's certainly a level of cooperation, and you can imagine if there's an issue that we're dealing with in our congregation, or we've got brethren over here, they're trying to push this doctrine of such and such or whatever it might be. Are you getting this? And yeah, we are. Here's what's happening. There's clearly a sharing of information. There's clearly a sharing of studying going on. The very fact that we have gospel meetings is confirmation of the idea that we kind of acknowledge that, yes, we're doing our individual work here, but we're also all kind of working on the same thing, aren't we? We all have fellowship in the gospel of Christ. The question is not whether we have cooperation between churches. The question is, what does it look like? And how do we manage that from the standpoint that we're still honoring the pattern of individual congregations with autonomy to do work that is assigned in that area, but still remembering that we're all one body. And it would be foolish of me to say that there's not resources in other parts of the world and other churches that could not benefit us in some way. Yeah, we should share the truth. We still assist each other. Yes. Hmm. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Their focus is always on what was originally revealed to them. Not gonna we're not binding something. We're not coming up with a new idea. You know what? The circumcision thing is really a problem. So what we probably need to do is manage that some way. So let's say, for example, we're going to make sure that the Jewish Christians, yes, you need to honor circumcision, and the Gentile Christians, you need to leave them alone. And so this is they don't give instructions on that. They simply say, as you say, stick to what's been revealed. Circumcision has no connection to salvation. We're not going to oppose that. We're not going to teach that. And anyone's doing that is parting from faith, and that's what Paul says, of course. So let's see. Any comments or thoughts? All right, I'm up for um, so if you noticed as you read this, he makes an argument. Brother Ramsey makes an argument about church cooperation that I'm not really sure is even the issue. You know, he shows examples. Look, churches cooperated with each other, and I think we would argue, well, yeah, yes, they did. But the problem is, do you notice he never once addresses the actual structure of cooperation that he has in mind? He simply says cooperation. Well, once we can say that we can cooperate, then however we do that, we just do whatever we want. Which is where he never discusses the idea, even if you accept the premise that he says about Paul, that Paul only received churches money from this one group, this one church, but these other churches sent to them. Even if you accept that, which is not true, what are we still talking about? We're still talking about one church sending funds to one man to do specific work that has been organized and authorized by God. Is there an intermediary that distributes money out to multiple congregations, to multiple preachers? We never see that, do we? We never see an organization that does that, church or otherwise, and we certainly never see the idea of an institution that is outside of the church that has been tasked with this goal. Who gets tasked, for example, when we talk about the collection for the saints? It's talked about in Romans 15. It's talked about in 1 Corinthians 16 and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Who is tasked with that? How does that work? Okay. But well, yeah, the church collects, and he says, in fact, let's look at what he says. Let's go to first, let's start with Romans 15. Or Romans 15. He'll go down in verse 25. He describes this work. He says, "At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints." Okay, what saints? Saints at Jerusalem, right? Not Judea, not Galilee, not the entire region of that. It's to Jerusalem, one city. As far as I know, we only know of one church that's in Jerusalem, right? So he's saying, I'm going to Jerusalem to bring aid for Macedonia and Achaia. Again, two regions that probably have multiple churches and multiple groups in them, have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Or they were pleased to do it, and he goes on to describe that relationship. So he says, when I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected. So he's delivering. Who's delivering it? Paul is. He's going to deliver this money to the church in Jerusalem. So who we got involved? We got multiple churches being collected from by an individual and delivered to the elders in that location. Now, if you go to 1 Corinthians 16, kind of see a little bit more of this. 1 Corinthians 16 says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so also are you to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is put aside something and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. In other words, all right, so now we see it's not just Paul that's going to bring this. Who else is going to be brought going to go with him? Okay, somebody from that particular church. Why, by the way, would it be so important for somebody from Corinth to go with Paul? Buddy, yeah. I, I want to make sure that you understand that this money is going where it needs to go and getting to the people that need to get it. By the way, that's an important point, and I don't know we talk about that enough in this question of institution. I think, Linda, you brought this up a while back. This idea that when I just send money off into the nether and I give it to some organization to do some work that I assume that they're doing, you know, not too long before I'm going to start realizing that they're not really doing what I thought they were supposed to become an institution. It's going off in other directions. It's spending more time supporting its own infrastructure than it is actually supporting the people that I'm sending money to help. And so that's one of the things I think that Paul's trying to make sure that they understand. I want you to know that everything that you're giving me is going where it needs to go to the people that need to have it. And so he describes that, and we won't go into 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, but it's the same process. Again, the idea that we've got people that are going to be assigned by the churches to do this, but there's no indication that they're not a collective, they're not an organization, there's no structure to them. This is just, I want you to go take care of this and bring this person and this person to make sure that it happens, right? That's not an institution. That's not an organization. And the implication, by the way, is that there's still, as you said, if there's accountability, do I still have authority over the money that I've sent? As long as Paul's got it in his pocket? As, does the Church of Corinth gives me money and says, I want you to take this to Judea? Whose authority is that money under, really? Yeah. It's still, yeah, because you're still responsible. You don't get to decide halfway down, well, you know what, I think these people need it more. Yeah. Until he gives it to the people that has been assigned to, it's the Corinthian money. They're the ones that they still have oversight on how that's going to be spent, which is why, of course, that they send somebody with them to monitor this whole thing. Because he can stand up and say, Paul, no, 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 no. That's supposed to go here. That's what we intended, that's what we agreed on. So there's some specific accountability that's baked into this whole process. So as you look through this, that was the thing that I kind of took away from this lesson, that even if you assume that what he is saying is accurate, all we still see is an example of individuals being assigned to bring funds from one source to another in a way in which it is authorized by God. Uh, there's nothing about an intermediary group, and there's certainly nothing about creating an organization that is now tasked with something that is beyond the scope of what the church has been authorized to do. Right? There's no discussion here about, well, let's set up orphan homes. Let's set up a missionary society that will be tasked with spreading the gospel. Of course, they didn't have radio stations back then, right? But at the same time, let's just have a group that we'll let them be in charge of fundraising, and they can go out and go to other churches and collect as much money as they want, and then they'll go ahead and do whatever they decide to do. One of the things that I think we talked about this a while back, but I wasn't alive back in the days of the Gospel Advocate or the days of the Herald of Truth or some of those things, and the radio station. Was Gospel Advocate, was that the radio station? What was the radio station, or was that Herald of Truth? That was Herald of Truth, all right? Yeah, yeah. Who did? Was it fair to say that the Herald of Truth had some power over local congregations? Absolutely, right? That scriptural by any stretch? An organization not ruled by an eldership, that is separate apart from the church, is now coming to a local church and saying, this is what you need to do, this is where you need to send your money, and if you don't, we're there are going to be consequences. Exactly. And it's the inevitable conclusion of what we start seeing when we start saying, well, this is just an expedient to do God's work. Well, it kind of takes on a life of its own there. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, in Kyle's point, I'm going to kind of skip ahead because I do want to get on to the next chapter, and I know if you've looked at Kyle's point in the next section, he talks about the importance of the proper structure and the proper authority, and he makes the argument that if I can say that I don't have to follow the church pattern in this way, what's to say that I can't follow? He came out of of the denomination. In fact, I think he said he came out of the institutional world, and he would spend time arguing with the Catholics about, look, this is the church organization that you have created, this idea of having a head bishop and all these things. And why did they do that? Well, because it was expedient. It's helpful for us because we can keep all these Gnostics under control and all these people that are spreading false teaching and doing all. The only way we're going to get this under control is if we have a central leadership over all these groups to make sure that they're all on the same page. Well, again, that sounds good, but it's not according to the pattern, and we see where it led. And his point was, how can I make this argument that that was wrong, but then turn around and say, but I can support this extra biblical organization here, and not only say that it's scriptural and expedient, but I can assume that it'll never take on a life of its own and go somewhere where I never intended it. And that's kind of the crux of his argument. If you haven't read it, it's a good article, and it makes some good points. But I'm not going to get into it because I know we're running out of time. Let's see if there's one other thing. Well, let's go and stop it there. Anybody have any other questions or comments real quick before we stop? All right. Well, then what we're going to do for next week, Lord willing, we're going to start in chapter 4, which is Buddy Payne's discussion on support of human institutions. And what I will probably do then is let's read, if you have time, go ahead and read both Buddy's and the one that Randy Duke writes right after him. And so we'll make some observations based out of that. All right. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.